What's up, Hudson Valley? For most of us, death is always just around the corner. There's no real way to avoid your inevitable demise. And for a normal person, it tends to be an uncomfortable subject. Very uncomfortable. It's not a topic you really want to bring up during something like an afternoon picnic or a Sunday stroll through the park, even if it's just a brief reminder. With all this in mind, there is still the undeniable fact that death is a universal experience that will eventually come to us all. Despite this, one of the more scenic and beautiful properties in Poughkeepsie is a cemetery. The Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, to be exact. Today, it stands as a 165-acre cemetery which sits on the edge of Poughkeepsie, overlooking the estuary known as the Hudson River. It sits conveniently located between various historic sites such as Locust Grove and Springside, acting as a stop on the way for both. Upon your immediate arrival, it is apparent that this is not your run-of-the-mill cemetery. Even without knowing, there is something interesting about its landscape that makes it hard to label as average. What's even more interesting is that normal people are buried here. For instance, I myself have 2 pairs of great-grandparents buried here. My grandmother's parents and my grandfather's parents. The funny thing is, I didn't know this until very recently. To me, it was just another piece of scenery sitting on the side of Route 9, a place that I just passed without noticing. Yet, once you do notice, it's hard to stop. The feeling of the grounds is amazingly unique for the final resting place of people who you would call your average folk. It's only until you dig below the surface that... Sorry, poor choice of words. What I'm getting at is this cemetery represents a very unique trend within the realm of landscape architecture, which evidently is still prevalent in our culture today. This would be the trend of the rural cemetery. Born out of a growing world, the rural cemetery was the result of church graveyards becoming overcrowded around the mid-19th century. Conveniently, this is also the time in history when Romanticism was a key Western idea. And on top of that, the teachings of men such as A.J. Downing were at their peak point of popularity. So it goes. This combination of both led to the rural cemetery becoming an accepted natural extension of landscape gardening. They are the perfect synthesis of life and death, giving people the opportunity to remember their loved ones while also giving them the opportunity to enjoy the life that they have. Of course, today, few people might think of a cemetery as the perfect synthesis of life and death, but during the antebellum era, these were places that if you were alive, you'd want to spend time. And that's exactly what people did. Writing in the Gardener's magazine in 1840, A.J. Downing praised these, quote, cemeteries as they were the first really elegant public gardens or promenades formed in this country.
Anybody interested in grabbing a couple of burgers and hitting the cemetery?
The birthplace of the rural cemetery movement in America, as it's known, was in Massachusetts, at a place now famously known as Mount Auburn Cemetery. It was first consecrated in 1831, and like Poughkeepsie Rural, Mount Auburn is still open and buries people even almost 200 years after the first burial plot was made. Edwin Booth is buried there.
What do you think of Booth's grave?
I like that one better. Imagine being buried next to such a cool one.
And so is a lot of people. And this turkey. And unlike most other established cemeteries, no specific religious affiliation was required at the time. It was non-denominational and open to the public. Quickly, Mount Auburn became a popular tourist destination with over 60,000 people visiting in 1848 alone. Even Emily Dickinson visited when she was 16. And she's famous for not getting out much. Mount Auburn embodies the rigor for rural cemeteries in the country. Contemporary descriptions called it a, quote, pleasure garden instead of a place for graves. For many, it almost excited a wish to die. For people at that time, places like Poughkeepsie Rural were the place to be on a Sunday afternoon, not only fulfilling obligations to dearly departed loved ones, but also giving them a break from their normal lives and something beautiful they can look forward to. And visiting on a nice sunny day, it is not hard to see how one could get lost in this place. Its winding paths go on, like the tendrils of memories, bringing you back to a time that once was. The Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery first opened in 1853 after a long search for the right property among the residents of Poughkeepsie. The specific needs for a rural cemetery in Poughkeepsie were brought on by a cholera epidemic in 1842 that made religious leaders nervous about sanitation and sanctity on top of the already full churchyards. In terms of churches, there is very little to no land they could provide to residents of the city. In 1852, a committee was formed by a few of these residents to find a piece of land for a new cemetery, as mentioned before. One man included in this endeavor was local brewer Matthew Vassar. He ended up purchasing a piece of property across the street from where the cemetery sits today, and his plan was to sell it back to the subscribers of the theoretical cemetery. As might be evident, his plans fell through, and Vassar ended up designating that property as his personal estate. Today, it is more famously known as Springside. However, that's a story for another day. Meanwhile, the committee eventually found its parcel of land across from Springside, a 54-acre property once part of the estate of Supreme Court Justice Smith Thompson. This land formed the nucleus of what exists today. The purchase was made possible by 60 citizens who invested $300 into the site with either the promise of a return on investment or the beginning of their own family plot. Many of the original plots still can be seen today. The grounds of the cemetery were designed by a man named Howard Daniels, who is today not a particularly well-known landscape architect. Daniels is contemporary of the men such as A.J. Downing, Calvert Vaux, and Frederick Law Olmsted. He spent a large portion of his career designing various landscapes and buildings across the country. For instance, his design for Central Park came in 4th place out of 35 applicants. He believed the park should have been bisected by a Grand Central Avenue, and he proposed a design for Vassar College, yet that was rejected. But his most famous achievement is the Montgomery County Courthouse in Dayton, Ohio. Modeled after an Athenian temple, it's a very cool-looking building. But perhaps the most plentiful area of his career is a number of rural cemeteries he is credited with designing. Over his 20-year career, Daniels designed cemeteries across the country, starting with a presence in the Midwest, designing cemeteries in cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus, Ohio, moving east in Pennsylvania to places like Erie, and eventually making his way to Poughkeepsie. No designs of his private grounds remain today, but it is still easy to see some of his beautiful work. Who knows? Maybe you have a friend buried in one of his cemeteries. In a description of one of his other cemeteries, it's clear to see the parallel between that of Poughkeepsie Rural. It is a place which incorporates hills, swales, sweeping vistas, a brook, and other woodland features in a complex of winding roads and paths that meander about the property. In simple terms, Daniels understood the picturesque as much as Downing, and brought it to Americans everywhere. Even today, as you drive by Poughkeepsie Rural on the highway, one is still able to enjoy the hills of the cemetery, rolling down into the ever-present river. Exploring the cemetery today, it doesn't matter who you are in for a treat. On my first visit, I was actually really overwhelmed by how much there was to explore. What I thought would only take a few hours would actually probably take many days to fully explore and appreciate. From the original 54-acre parcel, it has grown to 165 acres, expanding the property past its original dream twofold. It truly is a treasure trove.
God bless you.
I personally enjoyed the pond. And on top of the rolling hills and winding paths, there is also the effect of the many, many gravestones that mark the landscape. Beyond thousands and thousands of names are shown here. Some famous, and some unknown. In my research, only one word comes to mind to actually describe it: repose. It's not a term really used by Americans anymore, unless you have the same kind of outlook on life as Ferris Bueller. With media and content evolving so fast in the modern age, we don't get time to pause. And really observe the world around us. Simply put, the time for repose is reserved for your grave. However, we might be able to recognize places like Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery as a break from that. In the same way it was considered a place of repose when people relished in the memory of their dearly departed 150 years ago, it is also still a place where a person could take a break from the hustle and bustle of their day. If you go in the cemetery, not too far in even, you can just make out the whiz of a car going by. Yet, it is only a faint glimmer. Much like Poughkeepsie Rural acts as a physical bridge between Locust Grove and Springside, the rural cemetery movement represents a bridge between the early teachings of the landscape gardening movement and the theories implemented in Frederick Law Olmsted Central Park. Grappling with the stresses of modern life, maybe we can find one area of solace away from our lives, totally in sync with ourselves. And maybe that place is Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. This is Kevin Pakrad, signing off.